Paris, P-A-R-I-S. It is a pleasure to be here with you gentlemen. This is a very special day, June the 6th. That's D-Day. That's the day that the American troops and allies landed in Normandy. It's a special day because we've got a great country, and I'm just privileged to be here. And it's a good way to start a day. I was born in Lexington in 1929. That makes me 88 years old. And I was raised in Lexington. My mother was born and raised in Lexington, and my daddy came from Sandersville, Georgia. I went to grade grammar school and high school in Lexington. I was fortunate enough to play sports. We had a good town there. When I was born in Lexington, I must not have been a beautiful baby, because my daddy asked his brother, Herman Paris, he says, "What do you think, Herman?" And he said, "Thank God he's a boy, it won't matter." And so I was born in Lexington, and as I said, went to high school there. And from there, I went to Ole Miss for 4 years, and had a great time there, and had the grades to prove it. But I really enjoyed my stay at Ole Miss, and I appreciate the outline that Hubbard Light you gave me to go by here. And you mentioned that you wanted something said when I was a cheerleader at Ole Miss. I was head cheerleader for 3 years at Ole Miss and had quite some great experiences there. Once we were playing Vanderbilt in Nashville, and we were cheering, and my dear friend John Merle McCrae from Lexington was also a cheerleader. And Vanderbilt had an All-American end named Bucky Curtis. He was going down on a punt, and Ole Miss put 3 men on him, and they were blocking him on the cinders. And the Vanderbilt team ran out on the field, and the Ole Miss team ran out on the field. And so John said to me, "Let's go out there." And I said, "Okay, but don't say anything." He said, "Oh, I'm not going to say anything." We went out there, and this guard from Vanderbilt said, "What are you sissies doing out here?" Well, John decked him, put him on the ground with one leg. And then I felt somebody push me, and I weighed 119 pounds at the time, and I took a swing, and I hit an old policeman. And by him was a great big policeman, and he lifted me up with one hand. He said, "Son, you gonna get out of here." I said, "Yes, sir, I'm ready to go. I'm ready to get out of here." He said, "You gonna get out." He grabbed me with one arm and John the other, took us in front of the whole stadium, and my mother and daddy happened to be at the game, and they took us under the stadium and gave us some words of wisdom, to say the least. And when we got back to Ole Miss, we got to go to see the Dean of Men, who informed us that we were to cheer, not to fight. So that was one of my claims to fame. Another instance that happened at Ole Miss, of course, Ole Miss and State have had a tremendous rivalry. But my senior year, we had something unusual happen. Not many people know about this. I don't know who did what first, but the State Bulldog wound up at Ole Miss. And Ole Miss had a Confederate flag that covered the whole band, and that was missing at Ole Miss. And so a delegation of 3 of us went to State to negotiate. And neither the president of a student body at State, he had no more idea than the president of Ole Miss student body. His name was Jack Gary at the time. And we negotiated, and the Thursday before the kickoff, State got the Bulldog back, and we got our flag back. And I'd say lived happily ever after, not to say that there isn't still some bit of rivalry between Ole Miss and State. You asked for my favorite, what was my major and my favorite subject at Ole Miss. Well, I was in the School of Business, and I majored in marketing. And my favorite subject were girls. And I just really did have a great time at Ole Miss. After Ole Miss, I went straight to the Air Force, and then from the Air Force I went to Michigan State. University, and I did get my master's at Michigan State. You wanted me to comment about my marriage, and that'll be fun to do so. I dated this fine girl named Rosemarie Leonard from Kosciuszko, Mississippi, and when I finished school, I had to go to the Air Force for 2 years, and she went with American Airlines. She was a stewardess, and when I knew I wasn't going to go overseas the last 6 months, we got married. And you asked me to comment a little bit about my religion and hers and the difference in how we got together. Well, as you know, I'm Jewish, and she is a devout Presbyterian, and that did create some problems. Her family wasn't real happy about her being married to me, and I can understand. But anyway, we could not get a minister to marry us, nor a rabbi, nor a place. She was a member of the church in Kosciuszko, but they would not let us marry in the church. So we had no one to marry us and no place to get married. But she said, let's get married in my sorority house at Ole Miss. Her grandmother was the founder of Delta Gamma. So we were married in the Delta Gamma house at Ole Miss. And the minister was a Presbyterian minister in Lexington at the time, and he finally agreed to marry us. This is not something we don't publicize, but 6 months after he married us, he was admitted to the institute, mental institution. And I don't think our marriage had anything to do with that or not. We just had a great marriage, and we've been married 64 years, and I think we're going to stay together. It looks like we're going to make it. You asked me about my children. I have 3 children, and I have 9 grandchildren and 5 great-grandchildren and 1 on the way. And we are very, very fortunate. And you asked me to comment about the chapel, the Parish Yates Chapel in Oxford. Well, it has a history to it that we wanted to have a chapel there, and for years we tried to get it. And so my son Lee said that he would act as chairman if the school wanted it, which they did. The chancellor at the time, Robert Carriat, really wanted it. But we formed a committee of 35 people. Well, it's hard to get 35 people to agree to anything, but we wanted to have a Star of David and a cross as a window, as a key window in the chapel. And the committee said no, because you can't mix religion with government property, and we don't want that. And so if we were going to give the lead gift, and I said, well, okay, if you don't want it, we won't have a chapel. And so that was the end of it as far as I was concerned. One day, Lee, my son, called and said, Daddy, would you meet with me? We're going to meet with the ACLU. And I said, Lee, do you know what that is? And he said, yes, sir, Daddy, I do. And Lee has a law degree, but he's really not a lawyer, and he doesn't practice law, but the ACLU people had their attorneys, and only Lee and I went. And we talked to them for a good while, and they just said, well, this doesn't happen. And Lee said, well, there's a case in Austin, Texas. And Stephen F. Austin had a chapel there, and it had a cross. And the attorney for them said, yes, we're quite familiar with that. Said that is a family crest. A cross is a family crest. And so I got to thinking. I said, well, my wife is a Christian, and she lives by the cross, and I'm a member of the Jewish faith, and we have the Star of David. So that's our family crest. Well, I didn't fool them at all, and they said, and how long has that been your family crest? I said, about 30 seconds. And they started laughing and saw that we weren't trying to exclude, we were trying to include anybody that wanted to do that. Long story short, the chapel was built, and it's now at Ole Miss. I've had 2 grandchildren to get married there, and in August I'll have my 3rd grandchild to get married there. It's been used for funerals. Bodies are not there, but memorial services. And it's the Saturdays for the weddings are booked over a year in advance. And it's used about every night by some religious or some group that wants to use it. So that's been a real happiness for us. You mentioned settling in Indianola. Here we are in Indianola. This is a great town. We spent 50 great years here. We love Indianola, love the people here, and it was just wonderful for us to live here. I got to go to work at the Lewis Grocer Company. I spent 25 years with them, and it was a good experience, and I enjoyed it, but I had an experience to happen, and I'll tell you later about it, and I was ready to look for something else. I was playing tennis with Rogers Brazier and some other men. Maybe you heard, but I don't know. But after Roger said, I got to go, we're having a board meeting. The head of our bank here in Indianola is resigning, and we got to get somebody. And I said, and I'll tell you why later on. And I said, well, would you consider me? And said, what do you know about banking? And I said, I can trim produce, and I can cut meat, and I can use a check stand. He said, what's that got to do with banking? Anyway, long story short, they hired me as a branch manager here, and things went real well for me. And the greatest thing about Planters Bank, and I love them. I'm a stockholder now. I spent 25 years with Lewis Grocer Company, and I spent 30 years with Planters Bank. And we got the greatest people, I still say we, right here in Planters Bank and the system. My dad gave me some great advice once. He said, in management, always hire people smarter than you. And son, you won't have any trouble finding them. And so I didn't. And I'm not going to use names, but we have the greatest bunch of men and women that I could ever imagine a company have. And I had 30 great years here. One of the things that happened, and you've been a part of this, Hulbert, is the DIT, the Delta Invitational Tournament. One night, Dr. Walter Rose and Frank Crossway and I were somewhere. And my dad was dying of cancer, and he had a few months to live, and I said, I wish we could do something for cancer. And they said, we should. We ought to have some kind of a function for cancer. And tennis was real important, was real popular at the time. And so we decided that we would call it the Delta Invitational Tennis. Well, as time went on, we changed tennis to tournament because it encompasses more than tennis now. But we got some great tennis players here, and we started it. And it's been going on for, I think this was the 42nd year, and we've raised over $800,000, and it's been perpetuated since I've gone, and they're doing a great job doing it. But that was a DIT, and I really enjoyed playing a part in that for a number of years. You mentioned the Rotary Club. I was honored to be a member for over 50 years. My dad was president of the Durant, Mississippi Rotary Club, and I had the honor of being president of this club here in Indianola. And my son was a member of the Jackson Rotary Club. And you mentioned that you want me to comment on the Captains of Industry Award that I received, which was an award in Jackson that the Cystic Fibrosis sponsored to the outstanding businessman, and I don't know how I got it, but Archie Manning was the MC of it, and he said, tonight we've come to honor a great man who had great credentials, who's done so much for humanity. But unfortunately, he couldn't be with us tonight, so we're going to have Henry Parrish to be with us. So my head got big for just a minute, but then it came down. I was very fortunate enough to be the Citizen of the Year of Indianola. and I was flattered for that. We retired and moved to Oxford. We've lived there 4 years. We really enjoy it. The main reason we moved there is we have a lot of family there. I've got a lot of grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and a daughter that lives across the street from us, Irma does, and my son Lee and his wife are going to move to Oxford as soon as they can move their home in Jackson. And it's been a wonderful thing. We always like to come back to Indianola. My wife is still a member of the Indianola Bridge Club that she belongs, and I love to come back. And you mentioned that you'd like to comment on my hobbies, which I love to play golf. I get to play about once or twice a week in Oxford, and I come back here about once a month and play. I don't play tennis anymore, Hulbert, so you can't beat me anymore. And I had to retire from tennis. With bridge, I'm a terrible bridge player, but I'm not as bad as my wife thinks I am, and she's not as good as she thinks she is. So I play very little bridge. And you mentioned flying. I had the opportunity of flying with you, Hulbert, several times, and I was never the pilot that you were. I came to flying by just being afraid to fly. When I was working with Lewis Gross Company, we had a plane always, and Mr. Lewis used to make us fly in so terrible weather, and I got so frightened by flying that I prayed about it, and I said, if I could ever take one of these things up in the air by myself, maybe I could conquer flying. Well, I did. I kind of liked it, and I flew for 13 years, but if I wanted to fly anywhere with a cloud in the sky, I would ask Hulbert to fly with me, or somebody that was instrument rated. I never became instrument rated, and one day I was getting a briefing from a weather bureau, and I said, I'm going to fly from Indianola, Mississippi to Jackson, Mississippi. Could you give me a weather briefing? They said, oh, it's VFR all the way. That's visual flight rules. It's clear, no problem. I said, well, is it in front moving in? And he said, look, man, it's a cloud over Tucson, Arizona. And I said, well, could you tell me which way that cloud's moving? He said, maybe you better not get in that plane. But I did, and I enjoyed flying for 13 years, and I was not a good pilot, but I did enjoy flying. You asked me a question, what was the first thing that you bought with your own money? And that was a used car, and I never had a car in college. And when I went in the Air Force, I got to buy a used car, and that was the first thing I spent for money. Has anything ever happened to you that you thought was bad at the time, but turned out to be the best? Yes, this did happen to me, and that's a great question you ask. I was with the Lewis Gross Company for 25 years, and they had mandatory retirement at a certain age. I think he was 65 at the time, and Mr. Lewis was going to have to retire. Mr. C. and Lewis was president at that time, and Mr. Morris had already retired. And I just felt sure I was going to be made the president of Lewis Gross Company. But of course, this had to be cleared by SuperValue, which was a parent company headquartered in Minneapolis. I asked Mr. Lewis for permission for me to go up and talk to the chairman of the board of SuperValue and see where I stood, and he said, certainly. I went up there and I met with Mr. Jack Crocker, and I said, Mr. Crocker, I understand Mr. Lewis has got to retire. He said, that's right, that's a mandatory requirement. I said, I'd like to know where I stand. And he said, I wouldn't promise you a job in the morning. And that was quite a shock. Yes, that did happen to me. And I came back and I thought, I might ought to be thinking about doing something else. And that's how I became involved with Rogers and the bank here. And it was the best thing that ever happened to me business-wise. And I had the pleasure of getting to tell Mr. Crocker that years later, I'd gone into the food business as an investor with some people that I knew, and had gotten a great team together, and we had 22 stores, and we're the largest customer that they had in this division. Mr. Morris Lewis Jr., who was chairman of the board at Super Value at one time, called me and said, "Henry, you and Rose come over here and have a drink with us with Jack Crocker and his wife are here." And I said, "Gosh, Mr. Lewis, I'd love to do that." So I went over there, and I had a couple of drinks, and I said, "Mr. Crocker, I want to thank you for two things." I said, "Number one, you paid my dad through the week that he died, and I appreciate that. And you told me that you wouldn't promise me a job in the morning. And I quit the Lewis Grocery Company and went into banking and then got some food stores. And that was the greatest business decision I ever made was when I left you." And he laughed. Mr. Lewis laughed, and we were, lived happily ever after. A story does your family enjoy telling on you? And I would like to tell you, probably my wife enjoys this more than any. We've been to Normandy on several occasions, and one occasion we went there and we went to the cemetery. And it is a Jewish custom that you put rocks on the grave site. And I don't know the complete history of it, but I didn't know it. And so she said, "Look, I'm going to look at Mississippi graves." And I said, "Okay, I'm going to see if there's Jewish graves." So I went to look at them. They had rocks on them. I didn't know the custom of our religion, so I cleaned those rocks off. And my wife loves to tell this story. And I came back and I said, "I'm so mad that these graves have been desecrated. They put rocks on the Jewish." She says, "Don't you know your own religion?" So she helped me go back and we put the rocks back on the cemetery. She loves to tell that story. Another story I'd like to tell, and my dear friend Bill Gresham, who was just this town could be named Greshamville very easily. He was a retired brigadier general, and he went through the National Guards the last time he was in the service. And we went. He said, "Go with us to the Normandy invasion on June the 6th, and you can go with us in the National Guard group." And I said, "Well, I wasn't in the National Guard." He said, "It doesn't matter." I said, "Okay." So we went, and we went to the south of France, and they would come up and thank me for all I had done to free France during World War II. I said, "No, I was in the Boy Scouts then." They said, No, we know you did it." And they gave General Gresham a medal, and they gave me a medal. And I said, No, I wasn't in the war." They said, "We want you to have it." And so I thought today might be a good occasion for me to give this medal back to you to give to Walton Gresham, if you will. This is that medal that I do not deserve, but anyway, I want you to have it. And would you give that and tell Walton the story of that I've had it and I found it, and I thought, well, this would be a good occasion to do that.
I love it. I love it.
And so
perfect occasion, perfect timing.
I have had a great life, a wonderful life, and I sure enjoy my life that we have. You said, what are you most thankful for? And I can easily tell you that. The thing that I'm most thankful for is my relationship with my Lord, and I have, in management and in having meetings with employees, I said, if you can just give your job third place would be wonderful. Your Lord, your family, and your job. And I've tried to do that. And I'm so thankful not only for that, but for my wife and for my children, for my grandchildren, my great-grandchildren, for good health that I've really enjoyed. And I'm thankful that I live in a country which I'm so privileged to live in, this great country of ours. Thank you for this opportunity of chatting with you.
Thank you. I think that's awesome. I've got a couple of questions. There's a morning prayer service they have here Like, isn't there like,
yes, I did
How
stop.
old is that? How far back does that go?
I can tell you exactly.
Yeah.
I came
Please.
with the bank in
It's okay.
let's see, 1975, and we needed the Lord. Our bank needed it. This was not a well-run bank at the time. And I told them all, I said, let's have a prayer service, and each one of you will give the service, or you will be responsible for getting a service. And I'll have to check with them today, but I think to this day that we do have a prayer service every Wednesday, and I thank you very much for bringing that up.
I have another question. I've always been fascinated with Judaism, and then of course all religions. It's just totally endlessly fascinating for me. And I always wanted to do a documentary about being Jewish in the Delta. And one of these days I'll try to get around to doing that. But what was your early life as being Jewish in the Delta like? And can you talk about some of your earlier memories when you were young?
Yes, I can, Landry. I'll be glad to. Of course, I was born and raised in Lexington, and as a youngster, I was in contact with a little anti-Semitism from kids that would be there. Well, when I got big enough to go out for football, all of that seemed to end. It would end. I went to Ole Miss, and I did not get an invitation to any fraternity up there because I was Jewish. And that first week, my daddy prepared me. He said, you're not going to get a bid to any fraternity. There was a Jewish group up there that I did join. But after that first week, I never had any type of anti-Semitism or prejudice whatsoever. And I ran in 4 campus elections, and I never did experience any type of anti-Semitism whatsoever. When I moved to the Delta was after I'd gotten out of the Air Force, and I didn't experience any in the Air Force. And I didn't in the Delta. Indianola just was, but they had a man that lived here that before me, Morris Lewis Jr., who was just everything here. He was the president of Lewis Gross Company, the food company, and then Super Value, the parent corporation. He had made such a good name here, it was easy for me here. So I really have had very, very little prejudices.
Have you ever been back to Israel, or to Israel?
Thank you for asking that question. The greatest trip I've ever had, and my wife, is that we went to Israel. And it was a unique trip. There was a Jewish rabbi, a Baptist minister, and an Episcopal priest. They were all good friends in Jackson. They went over to Israel and planned a trip for a year from when they went there. So a couple in Jackson couldn't go, and they said that Rose and I could go. It was about 12 couples, and it was wonderful. I mean, it was just great, and we had so many wonderful experiences. I was getting some water out of the River Jordan, which I envisioned it being kind of like the Mississippi. It's not any much wider than this room. And I was getting some water from the River Jordan to bring back to our Methodist minister here, where he could use it in his services. And when I was there, the Baptist minister said, Parrish, if you fall in that, you know what we're going to do. We're going to baptize you. Little experiences like that. And one day we came in after visiting a lot of places. And one place we visited was an old building, and in the bottom was King David's tomb, and in the upper room was supposed to be the upper room where Jesus had his Last Supper. And that was the greatest trip I've ever been on. And we've been to Europe several times, and we've toured pretty much all over that. But my wife and I both agree that that was the most moving experience and the best place we've ever been.
What was your bar mitzvah like?
I wasn't bar mitzvah. That is what happens now. But I was confirmed, and confirmed you're about 12, 13 years old, and you study with the rabbi for a year, and then you give a little speech that they gave, and that was it. Now today it's bar mitzvah or bat mitzvah for a girl. You seem to know more about Judaism than I do.
Well, I've been endlessly fascinated, for a while. Even when I was younger, I wanted to be Jewish. That's another story altogether. What was your transition like when you left Super Valley and came to the bank? What was that like for you, like in those first few days, or that, it must have been pretty difficult.
Have you ever been real cold and had cold water thrown at you? It was a shock. It was a shock. I didn't know anything about banking. And I really didn't have anybody in there that could teach me. Now, I was under the auspices of a man named Ted Bordosky, who was the chairman of the board in Rouville, who helped me a lot and went along. I'd had a experience in buying and selling grocery stores and had some legal experience, but it was a shock. It was. I had a lot to learn. I never did learn it, but I did do what my daddy did. Told me, hire people that are smarter than you, and I did that. And it was an adjustment, a tremendous adjustment.
You have to be able to surround yourself with intelligent people, particularly ones who are
and they're the ones that made this bank, and they're now approaching retirement age in some of them, but you hire good people and they're going to hire good people. And they work for themselves, their families, and not for you.
There are a lot of people they don't want to put their ego aside, and they want to be the biggest man in the room at all times. Right. But if you can put that aside and put other people who are better skilled.
Absolutely. I had to put it aside because they knew more about this profession than I did. And I put it aside and let them run with it, and they scored.
Well, it was the right decision.
It was.
Your dad was correct.
Thank you.
Anything else you'd like to say? Like, how about the world today? What do you think about the current state of 2018 America?
I'm not qualified to speak on it. I just pray that our president can have the wisdom and the courage to lead us into peace and to prosperity. And at our worst, we're the best country in all the world. I mean, and there's a lot wrong with our country, but there's more of it that's right. And I dearly love our country. I don't want to go to Israel. I don't want to go anywhere. I don't want to go back to Oxford.
Good for you.
Awesome. I'm out of questions. I mean, it's one of those things that I'll come up with 12 more questions later tonight. So that's how it always works.
Well, thank you for asking, Landry. You asked some very intelligent and thought-provoking questions.
Thank you. I wish my dad was here. He couldn't make it this morning. We were trying.
Well, you give him my very best. I think the world of him. Please do.
I can't wait for him to see this. He'll start crying. Trust me. Tears of joy too.
Thank you. I don't know why you're doing it, but I thank you for doing it, and it's been a pleasure.
And would I be sure that this is love beyond compare? Would all this be true if I didn't care?